To the public, he was Archduke Ludwig Viktor Joseph Anton of Austria, a symbol of imperial masculinity and duty. But in the shadows, he was Luziwuzi, a cross-dressing aesthete who despised the military and craved the forbidden. He was the pink sheep of a family that demanded absolute perfection. How did the emperor's favorite little brother become the ghost of Salzburg, locked away in a golden cage until history forgot his name? To find the answer, we must look to the peculiar indulgences of his childhood. The Germans have a word for this specific type of upbringing, Narrenfreiheit, or fool's freedom. It implies a license to break the rules, a permission to be eccentric that is granted only to court jesters and favored children. While his brother, Franz Joseph, was learning how to suppress a rebellion, Ludwig Viktor was learning how to choose the perfect shade of silk for a waistcoat. While Maximilian was dreaming of naval conquest, Ludwig was arranging flowers in his mother's drawing room. He was kept by her side constantly, a permanent fixture in her salon, absorbing the gossip of the high aristocracy rather than the strategies of generals. He grew up listening to the rustle of crinolines and the sharp whispered wit of court ladies, and he learned very quickly that a well-placed insult could be just as devastating as a cannonball. The era of his childhood, known as the Biedermeier period, further shaped his sensibilities. It was a time of peculiar contradiction in Vienna. On the surface, it was an age of cozy domesticity, of waltzes, of Schubert's Lieder, and of apolitical comfort. The middle class was rising, obsessing over beautiful furniture, porcelain figurines, and the sanctity of the home. But underneath this veneer of Gemütlichkeit lay a police state run by Prince Metternich, where censorship was absolute and spies were everywhere. Ludwig Viktor absorbed this duality into his very bones. He learned that life was a performance, that beauty was a shield, and that the most important things were often the ones left unsaid. He developed an obsession with the aesthetic of the Biedermeier, the clutter of beautiful objects, the horror vacui, or fear of empty space, where every tabletop had to be covered in knickknacks. This was not just a hobby. It was a way of building a wall against the cold, empty reality of his family's emotional distance. However, the cozy world of the nursery was shattered in 1848. When Ludwig was just 6 years old, the year of revolutions set Europe on fire. The people of Vienna rose up against the monarchy. The cozy Biedermeier citizens built barricades in the streets, lynched the minister of war, and threatened to storm the Hofburg. The imperial family was forced to flee the capital in the dead of night, retreating to the loyal fortress city of Innsbruck in the Tyrol. For a 6-year-old boy, this must have been a terrifying adventure. The smell of smoke, the fear in the eyes of the servants, the sudden vulnerability of the people who were supposed to be gods on earth. It was during this exile in Innsbruck that the family dynamic crystallized forever. In December of 1848, in the archiepiscopal palace at Olomouc, Ludwig's feeble father was convinced to renounce his rights to the succession, and his 18-year-old brother, Franz Joseph, was crowned emperor. Ludwig Viktor watched as his brother, the boy he had played with, was transformed into his apostolic majesty. Franz Joseph knelt before their mother, weeping, overwhelmed by the burden placed upon his shoulders. "Goodbye to my youth," the new emperor reportedly said. At that moment, an invisible chasm opened between the brothers. Franz Joseph became the state, cold, distant, overworked, and burdened by God. Ludwig Viktor remained the child, free, useless, and increasingly resentful of the golden cage that trapped them both. As the 1850s dawned, and the young emperor consolidated his power with a regime of neo-absolutism, Ludwig Viktor entered adolescence. This is the period where the problem of his character began to worry the court chamberlains. The education of an archduke was a rigid, predefined path. At a certain age, they were expected to show an aptitude for the military. They were given uniforms, taught to ride, to shoot, to command a regiment. It was not optional. The Habsburg uniform was the skin of the dynasty. To be out of uniform was to be naked. Ludwig Viktor, however, was a disaster in uniform. He found the coarse wool itchy. He hated the mindless drills. He had no head for strategy and no stomach for violence. When he sat on a horse, he looked like a sack of potatoes, lacking the erect, martial posture that defined his brothers. But it was more than just physical ineptitude. There was a softness to him, a fluidity in his gestures, and a lilt in his voice that made the old generals uncomfortable. In the hyper-masculine world of the Austrian military, where duels were fought over perceived slights and honor was paramount, Ludwig Viktor was an alien creature. He preferred the company of his mother's ladies-in-waiting, helping them choose fabrics and critiquing the fashion of rival aristocrats with a biting, vicious wit that became his trademark. It was around this time that the nickname Luziwuzi began to stick. It was a baby talk variation of his name, Ludwig, but it carried a subtle infantilizing venom. It branded him as the eternal child, the one who could not be taken seriously. Yet, within the family circle, he was still indulged. His mother, perhaps sensing that he would never be a soldier, allowed him to cultivate his artistic side. He showed a genuine talent for design and a connoisseur's eye for art. He began to collect obsessively. He didn't just want one beautiful snuff box, he wanted hundreds. He wanted to possess beauty, perhaps because he felt so at odds with the rigid ugliness of the military barracks. There is a pivotal, often hushed-up aspect of Habsburg adolescence that Ludwig Viktor seemingly bypassed. It was an open secret in the courts of Europe that royal princes, upon reaching puberty, were educated in the physical aspects of marriage. This was usually handled with clinical discretion. A hygiena dame, often an actress or a discreet aristocratic widow, carefully screened by court physicians for disease, would be introduced to the young prince to initiate him into heterosexual intimacy. This was considered a matter of state security. The dynasty needed heirs, and the princes needed to know how to produce them. For Ludwig Viktor, the records are silent on this rite of passage. Instead, the whispers began to drift up from the barracks and the stables. The Archduke was seen spending too much time with handsome aides-de-camp. His gaze lingered too long on the broad shoulders of the cavalry officers. He was uninterested in the ballerinas who threw themselves at his feet, but he could talk for hours about the physique of a statue in the Belvedere Gardens. In the 1850s, the concept of homosexuality as a fixed identity did not exist in the medical books. The term wouldn't be coined until later in the century, but the behavior was recognized, and in the military code it was a crime. Yet, because he was an archduke, a magic circle of silence was drawn around him. The police, who monitored everyone in Vienna, began to keep a file on him. It was a file that would grow thicker with every passing year, filled with reports that were stamped state secret and buried in the deepest vaults of the Ministry of the Interior. While his brothers were busy expanding the empire, Ludwig Viktor was busy expanding his wardrobe. In 1854, the teenage Emperor Franz Joseph married the breathtakingly beautiful Elizabeth of Bavaria, known to history as Sisi. The arrival of Sisi threw the court into turmoil. Sophie, Ludwig's mother, hated the rebellious, free-spirited Sisi. The court split into factions. And here, Ludwig Viktor showed his true colors. He did not side with the young romantic empress. He sided with his mother. He became Sophie's spy, her ears in the palace. He would sit in Sisi's salon, smiling and making polite conversation, only to run back to his mother and report every word, every complaint, every breach of etiquette the young empress had committed. This malicious streak is crucial to understanding him. He was not a saintly victim. He was a complex, often vindictive man. Perhaps his cruelty was a defense mechanism. He knew he was the defective brother, the one the soldiers laughed at behind his back. So he weaponized his tongue. He learned that if he could not command respect with a sword, he could command fear with gossip. He became the most dangerous man in Vienna to invite to dinner, because by the time the dessert was served, he would have cataloged every flaw in your household, every faded curtain, and every whispered rumor about your daughter, and he would broadcast it to the entire city the next day. By the time he reached his 20s, in the early 1860s, the Luziwuzi problem was becoming a dynastic liability. His brothers were men of the world. Franz Joseph was the father of the nation. Maximilian was the viceroy of Lombardy, Venetia, ruling over Italians with his beautiful wife Charlotte. Karl Ludwig was dutifully marrying princesses and producing children. Ludwig Viktor was alone, drifting through the ballrooms of Vienna like a ghost in gold braid, surrounded by a sycophantic entourage of young men who were clearly more interested in his purse than his personality. The pressure to marry him off became intense. The Habsburgs viewed marriage as a geopolitical transaction, and a single archduke was a wasted asset. Lists of eligible Catholic princesses were drawn up. Photographs were exchanged. But Ludwig found a flaw in every single candidate. She was too short. She was too tall. Her nose was wrong. Her family was too boring. It was a game of delay. He knew deep down that he could not play the role of husband and father. The very thought repulsed him. He was living a double life, the public prince who attended mass and stood on balconies, and the private aesthete who yearned for a world where he didn't have to pretend. Then came the Mexican adventure. It was the moment that could have changed everything. Napoleon III of France had convinced Maximilian to accept the crown of Mexico. It was a mad, romantic, doomed scheme, but Maximilian was blinded by ambition. He needed a successor. He looked at Ludwig Viktor, young, unoccupied, and seemingly malleable, and offered him the world. The plan was grand. Ludwig would travel to Brazil, charm the daughter of Emperor Pedro II, marry her, and unite the crowns of South and North America. For a brief moment, the history of the Americas hung in the balance. Imagine a Habsburg Empire stretching from the Rio Grande to the Amazon. But Ludwig Viktor looked at the map, and he looked at the reports of the heat, the mosquitoes, the revolutions, and the crude colonial society of Mexico. He compared it to the soft gaslight of Vienna, the opera, the pastry shops, the comfortable anonymity of his secret life, and he refused. He dug his heels in with a stubbornness that shocked his family. "I will not go," he said. "I will not marry." His refusal was seen as cowardice. The court sneered that he was afraid of the ocean, afraid of the savages, afraid of leaving his mother's skirts, and perhaps he was. But in hindsight, it was the only act of self-preservation available to him. He chose his own gilded cage over a foreign throne. He chose to be a pariah in Vienna rather than a puppet in Mexico. When Maximilian sailed away to his tragic destiny, to the dust and blood of Querétaro, Ludwig stayed behind. He watched the ships leave from the safety of the dock, knowing that he had disappointed everyone, but also knowing that he was safe. But safety in Vienna came at a price. With the Mexican option off the table, he had to define a role for himself in a city that had no use for him. He could not be a soldier. He could not be a statesman. He could not be a husband. so he decided to become an icon. If he couldn't rule the empire, he would rule the social season. He would build a palace that would make the emperor's residence look like a barracks. He would throw parties that would be talked about for decades. He would embrace the Luziwuzi persona and push it to its absolute limit. He turned his attention to the Ringstrasse. The old city walls had been demolished in 1857, opening up a vast empty canvas of land surrounding the ancient center. It was the greatest urban construction project in Europe, a chance to build a new, modern Vienna. While the bourgeoisie were building apartment blocks and town halls, Ludwig Viktor secured a prime plot of land on the Schwarzenbergplatz. He hired the illustrious architect Heinrich von Ferstel, the man who was building the votive church, and gave him a simple instruction: build me a palace fit for a Renaissance prince. The construction of the Palais Erzherzog Ludwig Viktor was not just a building project. It was a statement of identity. While the Hofburg was a fortress of protocol, Ludwig's palace was designed for pleasure. It had a massive ballroom, a winter garden filled with exotic plants that required a small army of gardeners to maintain, and a dining room that could seat 50 people on chairs upholstered in the finest velvet. But the most telling details were the private quarters. Here, Ludwig indulged his obsession with the feminine aesthetic. He designed boudoirs that looked like they belonged to a French queen, filled with delicate porcelain, mirrors, and silks. To step through the heavy oak doors was to leave the reality of the empire and enter a chaotic fantasy. Ludwig Viktor suffered from an acute case of horror vacui, the fear of empty space. There was not a single square inch of wall left unadorned. The salons were choked with heavy Makart-style bouquets of dried flowers, peacock feathers, velvet drapes that pooled on the floor like spilled wine, and vitrines filled with his ever-growing collection of snuff boxes. To his sycophantic circle, it was a masterpiece. To the rigid traditionalists, it was a suffocating nightmare. It was here, as the mortar dried on his new palace in the mid-1860s, that Ludwig Viktor began to cultivate a shadow court. If he wasn't welcome in the war rooms of the empire, he would create a world where he was the center of gravity. He invited the people that the rigid court snubbed: actors, singers, dancers, and the nouveau riche Jewish bankers who were financing the city's expansion but were often excluded from the highest aristocratic circles. And of course, he invited the men. It was a dangerous time to be so bold. The 1860s were a decade of disaster for Austria. The empire lost the war against Prussia in 1866, effectively getting kicked out of Germany. The defeat at the Battle of Königgrätz was a national humiliation. The economy was shaky. The people were angry. And amidst this national gloom, there was the emperor's brother, building a pleasure palace, spending fortunes on flowers, and giggling in the boxes of the opera house, while the casualty lists were posted on the church doors. The contrast was grotesque. The public began to loathe him. They saw him as a parasite, a symbol of the dynasty's decadence. The nickname Luziwuzi began to appear in the satirical pamphlets, no longer affectionate, but dripping with scorn. Yet Ludwig seemed immune to the criticism. Or perhaps he just pretended to be. He wore his unpopularity like a badge of honor. He walked the streets of Vienna not in a uniform, but in impeccably tailored civilian suits, often carrying a fan or a parasol, flanked by his handsome adjutants. He was testing the boundaries, seeing how far he could push the fool's freedom before the emperor snapped. He was dancing on the edge of a volcano and the lava was rising. As we close the chapter on his youth, we see a man fully formed in his contradictions. He is wealthy beyond imagination, yet emotionally bankrupt. He is surrounded by people, yet profoundly alone. He is a prince of the blood, yet an outcast in his own family. The stage is set for the tragedy that will follow. The golden cage of his childhood has become the pleasure palace of his adulthood, but the locks are still on the doors, and the key is held by a society that will never, ever accept him for who he is. It was in this setting that the Archduke began to host his legendary soirees. These were not the stiff, formal balls of the Hofburg, where etiquette dictated every bow and every word. These were artistic gatherings, a code word in Viennese society for slightly loose morals. He invited the opera singers, the actors from the Burg Theater, and the painters who were coloring the city's new golden age. But more importantly, he invited the men. This is where the tragedy of Ludwig Viktor becomes inextricably linked to the sociology of Victorian-era sexuality. In the 19th century, the concept of sexual identity was murky. There was no gay community in the modern sense, but there was a vast, unspoken underground. In a city like Vienna, which was garrisoned by thousands of young soldiers, a distinct culture had emerged. The military uniform was the ultimate fetish of the era. It represented virility, power, and the state. For a man like Ludwig Viktor, who had failed to become a soldier, the obsession with the uniform became a psychosexual fixation. The Archduke's palace became a sanctuary for a specific type of transaction. Young officers, often from poor aristocratic families, and perpetually in debt due to the high cost of maintaining their mess bills and uniforms, found a willing patron in the emperor's brother. He would invite them for dinner, praise their physique, critique their tailoring, and often send them home with expensive gifts or loans that were never expected to be repaid. It was a predatory dynamic, certainly. The imbalance of power between an imperial archduke and a junior lieutenant was vast, but it was also a relationship of mutual exploitation. The soldiers got their debts paid, the archduke got the illusion of adoration. But the open secret of Ludwig Viktor's life was not contained within the walls of his palace. He was a flamboyant figure on the streets of Vienna. While his brother, Emperor Franz Joseph, dressed in the simple, austere uniform of a field marshal and worked 14 hours a day at a standing desk, Ludwig Viktor paraded through the city like a peacock. He was a regular fixture at the Prater, the great public park, driving his carriage slowly so he could admire and be admired by the crowds. He wore civilian suits cut from the finest English wool, accessorized with colorful cravats, jeweled tie pins, and gloves of the softest kid skin. He was often seen stopping his carriage to converse with handsome cab drivers or stable hands, a breach of class protocol that horrified the upper crust, but amused the working class. The police, specifically the secret police under the Ministry of the Interior, watched it all. The archives of the Austrian state are filled with reports from this period, detailed observations of the Archduke's movements. His Imperial Highness was seen at the Volksgarten talking for 20 minutes with a dragoon, a spy would write. His Imperial Highness visited the dressing room of the actor X. These reports were filed, stamped, and sent up the chain of command, eventually reaching the emperor's desk. Franz Joseph read them with a heavy heart. He was a man of absolute discipline, who believed that the Habsburgs were appointed by God to lead. To have a brother who was essentially cruising for rough trade in the public parks was not just a family embarrassment, it was a theological crisis. How could God's anointed family produce such a flaw? Yet, the emperor did nothing. This paralysis is one of the most fascinating aspects of the story. Franz Joseph operated on a policy of discretion. As long as the scandal remained a whisper and didn't hit the newspapers, it didn't exist. He tolerated Ludwig's behavior because confronting it would mean acknowledging it, and acknowledging it would shatter the illusion of imperial perfection. So, a strange, tense truce developed. Ludwig could do as he pleased, provided he never ever crossed the line into public criminality. But Ludwig pushed. He pushed hard. He began to experiment with photography, a new and exciting technology. In the privacy of his palace, he staged elaborate tableaux vivants, living pictures. Rumors began to circulate about what exactly was being photographed. Servants whispered about costumes, not just historical costumes, but women's clothing. There are surviving photographs from this era that are truly shocking for the time. Ludwig Viktor, the Archduke of Austria, posing in a composite shot where he appears as both a man and a woman flirting with himself. In another, he is draped in fabrics that look suspiciously like a skirt. These were not just jokes, they were expressions of a fluid gender identity that had no name in 1870s Vienna. He was signaling to anyone who was looking that the prince was a performance, and the real Ludwig was someone else entirely. As he grew older, the cute eccentricity of his youth hardened into a brittle, malicious persona. If he could not be respected, he would be feared. He transformed his social exclusion into a reign of terror. His weapon was gossip. He spent his days collecting secrets. He knew who was sleeping with whom, who was bankrupt, who had an illegitimate child, and whose jewels were paste. And he used this information with surgical precision. He would attend a ball, scan the room with his monocle, and then loudly make a comment that would destroy a reputation in seconds. "Oh, look at Countess B," he might say, "wearing that necklace again. I suppose her husband hasn't managed to pay off his gambling debts to the jeweler yet." The court laughed because it was funny, but they also trembled. Everyone was terrified that they would be next. He was like a venomous spider sitting in the center of a web of silk and scandal. This malice earned him powerful enemies. The most formidable of these was Empress Elizabeth, Sisi. The beautiful, melancholic empress despised Ludwig Viktor. To Sisi, Ludwig represented everything she hated about the Viennese court. He was artificial, catty, obsessed with protocol and hierarchy, and fundamentally cruel. She called him that evil tongue. Ludwig, in turn, hated Sisi for her beauty, her popularity, and her refusal to play by the rules he had mastered. He became the primary source of the nasty rumors about Sisi's mental health and her absences from Vienna. When Sisi fled the suffocating court to travel the world, Ludwig was the one whispering that she was abandoning her duty and her husband. It was a war of attrition between the tragic queen and the queer prince, fought not with swords, but with whispers in the corridors of the Hofburg. But an even more dangerous enemy was rising in the wings. Archduke Franz Ferdinand, the emperor's nephew and the heir to the throne, was a man of violent, aggressive masculinity. Franz Ferdinand loved two things: shooting animals — he killed over 200,000 game animals in his life — and the Catholic Church. He looked at his uncle Ludwig Viktor with visceral disgust. To Franz Ferdinand, Ludwig was a degenerate, a sodomite, who was polluting the bloodline. Franz Ferdinand was not a man of discretion like the emperor. He was a moral crusader. He openly mocked Ludwig, referring to him with slurs and refusing to be in the same room with him. The tension between the two was electric. Franz Ferdinand was waiting for a slip-up, a reason to crush his uncle, and Ludwig, perhaps sensing this, became even more reckless, as if daring the heir to strike. The 1880s and 1890s passed in a blur of waltzes and decadence. This was the fin de siècle, the end of the century, a time when Vienna was obsessed with death and pleasure. The empire was rotting from the inside, paralyzed by ethnic conflicts and a calcified bureaucracy, but the surface was more glittering than ever. Ludwig Viktor was the avatar of this decay. He was aging. The pretty boy looks of his youth were fading. He was becoming stout, his face puffy from rich food and wine, his hair thinning. The young gods of the military barracks were no longer interested in him for his beauty, only his money. The transactional nature of his relationships became more obvious, more desperate. He began to frequent the public bathhouses. This was a dangerous escalation. The baths were democratic spaces. In the steam and the water, rank stripped away. An archduke was just a naked man. The central bath in Vienna, with its labyrinth of steam rooms and shadowy corners, became his preferred hunting ground. For years, Ludwig had visited under the cloak of his status. The managers of the baths, honored by imperial patronage, turned a blind eye. The police detectives assigned to follow him stayed outside, noting the entry and exit times but never daring to intervene. But the atmosphere in Vienna was changing. The rise of the Christian Social Party, led by the populist anti-Semite Karl Lueger, brought a new wave of moral puritanism to the city politics. The decadence of the aristocracy was coming under fire. The working class was angry. The socialists were organizing. The idea that an archduke could abuse his power to prey on young men, sons of the working class, was becoming a political powder keg. Ludwig Viktor seemed oblivious to these shifts. He was living in a bubble of his own creation, surrounded by yes-men and paid companions. He believed in the divine right of the Habsburgs to do whatever they pleased. He believed that the laws of gravity did not apply to him. He continued to host his parties, continued to wear his flamboyant suits, continued to make his vicious jokes. He did not see that the ground beneath his feet had turned to quicksand. As the new century dawned, the year 1900 bringing with it the promise of modernity, psychoanalysis, and revolution, Ludwig Viktor was a relic. He was a Baroque prince, stranded in the age of the steam engine and the machine gun. The emperor was old and tired. The empress was dead, assassinated by an anarchist in Geneva in 1898, a tragedy that plunged the court into eternal mourning. The protective shell of the family was cracking. Franz Ferdinand was impatiently waiting for the emperor to die so he could clean house. The wolves were circling, and still Ludwig went to the baths. It was a compulsion. It was the only place where he felt truly alive, where the physical touch he craved was available, however fleeting and bought it might be. He did not know that his next visit would be his last. He did not know that the slap was coming, the slap that would be heard around the world, the slap that would shatter the silence of 50 years. The golden years of Luziwuzi were effectively over. The stage was set for the fall. The tragedy was no longer a slow burn. It was about to become an explosion. The man who had spent his life building a fortress of beauty against the ugliness of the world was about to find out that glass houses shatter very easily when stones are thrown. The year was 1904, though some whispers suggest it happened earlier, buried under layers of imperial censorship. The location was the Central Bad on Weibergasse, a cathedral of steam and tiles located just a short walk from St. Stephen's Cathedral. To understand the catastrophe that was about to unfold, one must understand the Central Bad itself. It was not merely a place to wash. It was an architectural marvel of the late Habsburg era, designed in a neo-Moorish style that evoked the sensuality of the Orient. The walls were lined with intricate ceramics. The floors were mosaics of blue and gold, and the air was thick with the scent of pine and sulfur. It was a place where the rigid class structures of Vienna dissolved in the mist. In the steam rooms, a banker looked the same as a baker, and a general looked the same as a private. It was a space of vulnerability and anonymity, or so the patrons believed. Archduke Ludwig Viktor walked into this establishment with the confidence of a man who owns the world. He was 62 years old now. The lithe, soft features of his youth had thickened and his hair was receding, but his arrogance remained untouched. He was accompanied, as always, by the invisible shield of his rank. He believed that his name alone was enough to protect him from the consequences of his desires. He had come to the Central Bad many times before. He knew the layout, the dark corners, the unspoken codes of eye contact and lingering gestures that signaled availability in the queer underground of the city. But on this particular day, the codes failed. The specific details of the encounter have been blurred by a century of gossip and the deliberate destruction of police files. But the core of the story remains consistent across every account. The Archduke spotted a young man. Accounts vary on his identity. Some say he was a dashing young officer from a provincial regiment. Others claim he was a simple bathhouse attendant or a tradesman. Whatever his station, he was young, fit, and, crucially, unwilling. Ludwig Viktor made his move. It was likely a gesture he had made 1,000 times before. A hand placed on a thigh, a suggestive whisper, a lingering touch in the crowded steam room. He expected the usual reaction, a shy smile, a deferential bow, or perhaps a negotiated exchange of favors. He was, after all, the emperor's brother. Who would dare say no? The young man dared. He did not freeze. He did not politely decline. He reacted with the instinctive violent rage of a man who felt his honor had been assaulted. He pulled back his hand and struck the Archduke across the face. The sound of the slap die Wachen must have sounded like a gunshot in the tiled acoustics of the bathhouse. Time stopped. The chatter in the pool died instantly. The steam seemed to clear. Every eye turned to the source of the noise. There stood the Archduke of Austria, the brother of his apostolic majesty, clutching his cheek, his eyes wide with a mixture of pain and absolute shattering disbelief. And standing opposite him was a nobody, a commoner, his chest heaving, his fist still clenched. In that frozen second, the entire legal and social structure of the Habsburg Empire hung in the balance. Under the penal code, striking a member of the imperial house was a crime of the highest order, bordering on treason. The punishment could be death or at the very least decades in a dark dungeon. By all rights, the police should have been summoned, the young man dragged away in chains, and the Archduke comforted. But nothing happened. The Archduke did not scream for the guards. The bathhouse manager, rushing to the scene, did not order the young man's arrest. Why? Because to arrest the man would require a trial. A trial would require testimony, and testimony would require explaining why the man had slapped the Archduke. It would require stating in open court that Archduke Ludwig Viktor had sexually solicited a man in a public bath. It would confirm, under oath, the open secret that the dynasty had spent 40 years trying to hide. The silence that followed the slap was the sound of the Habsburg prestige cracking. Ludwig Viktor, red-faced and humiliated, scrambled to gather his dignity. He fled the bathhouse. He dressed hurriedly, his hands shaking, and rushed to his carriage. He likely told himself that it would blow over, that his brother would protect him, that the police would silence the witnesses. He was wrong. Vienna was a city that lived on gossip. It was the fuel that powered the coffee houses. By the time Ludwig Viktor reached his palace, the story was already circulating at Café Greenstidel and Demel's. Have you heard? Luziwuzi got slapped. The whispers turned into roars. The story mutated, becoming more salacious with every retelling. In some versions, it was a brawl. In others, he was thrown into the pool. But the core truth was undeniable. The emperor's brother had been physically chastised by a commoner for his sexual deviancy. The news reached the Hofburg Palace not through the newspapers, which were forbidden from printing such scandal, but through the terrified report of the police president. He stood before Emperor Franz Joseph, shifting uncomfortably in his uniform, and delivered the news. Franz Joseph sat at his desk, the weight of the empire on his shoulders. He was an old man now, weary from a life of tragedy. His wife was dead, his son was dead, and now his brother had humiliated the family name in the most vulgar way possible. The emperor was a man of immense self-control, but this was too much. The sanctity of the dynasty depended on the perception of moral superiority. If the people laughed at the Habsburgs, they would eventually stop obeying them. It was at this moment that Archduke Franz Ferdinand stepped out of the shadows. The heir to the throne had been waiting for this. He despised Ludwig Viktor with a holy fervor. To Franz Ferdinand, Ludwig was a symptom of the rot that was killing Austria. He argued that this could not be swept under the rug. He is a cancer, Franz Ferdinand reportedly argued. He must be cut out. The heir demanded a solution that was final. There could be no more warnings, no more ballerina jokes. The scandal was public. The punishment had to be total. The emperor agreed. The order was drafted. It was not a suggestion. It was an imperial command. Archduke Ludwig Viktor was to be banished from Vienna. He was to be stripped of his military patronages. He was to be removed from the list of active members of the court. He was to retire to his summer estate, Schloss Klesheim in Salzburg, and he was to stay there. He was effectively placed under house arrest, exiled to the provinces, far away from the temptations of the capital. The scene of his departure from Vienna was a tragic farce. There was no grand farewell. There were no crowds waving flags. Ludwig Viktor had to pack his life into crates. He walked through the halls of his beloved palace on the Ringstrasse, the palace he had built, the rooms he had decorated with such obsession, knowing he would likely never see them again. He looked at his porcelain, his paintings, his velvets. He was leaving behind not just his home, but his identity. In Vienna, he was a player, a wit, a presence. In Salzburg, he would be a ghost. As his train pulled out of the station, steaming toward the mountains in the west, Ludwig Viktor must have felt a profound sense of bitterness. He had played the game by the rules of the aristocracy, hypocrisy. He had kept his life discreet enough, he thought. He had married the art since he couldn't marry a woman. He had done everything to compensate for his nature, but one slip, one moment of misjudgment in the steam, and it was all over. The city he loved, the city that he had helped design and entertain, was spitting him out. The exile to Salzburg was intended to be a social death. The emperor sent secret instructions to the military garrison in Salzburg. No officer is to accept an invitation from Archduke Ludwig Viktor. No military bands are to play at his events. He is to be saluted, but ignored. This was a calculated cruelty. By cutting him off from the military, the emperor was cutting him off from the primary symbol of Austrian male society. Ludwig was to be isolated, surrounded only by servants and the provincial nobility who were too unimportant to matter. When he arrived at Schloss Klesheim, it was winter. The palace, built for the Prince Archbishops of Salzburg, was beautiful but cold. It stood in the middle of a vast park, isolated from the town. The silence was deafening compared to the bustle of the Ringstrasse. Ludwig Viktor wandered the empty halls, a king without a kingdom. He was 62, disgraced and alone, but history is full of surprises. The emperor and Franz Ferdinand expected Ludwig Viktor to wither away and die of shame. They expected him to rot in silence. They underestimated him. They forgot that beneath the velvet and the perfume, Ludwig Viktor was still a Habsburg. He had pride, and he had money, vast amounts of it. Instead of retreating into the shadows, Ludwig Viktor decided to reinvent himself. If Vienna didn't want him, he would make Salzburg love him. If he couldn't be the prince of the capital, he would be the king of the province. He began to renovate Klesheim with a manic energy. He built a winter palace on the grounds so he could live comfortably year-round. He transferred his massive art collection from Vienna to Salzburg, filling the provincial palace with treasures that rivaled the Hofburg. And then he turned his attention to the people. The simple, conservative Catholic farmers and townsfolk of Salzburg knew nothing of the bathhouse scandal. To them, he was simply the emperor's brother. They were honored to have him. They didn't care about his effeminate mannerisms or his bachelorhood. They cared that he was rich and that he was there. Ludwig began to spend. He became the greatest philanthropist Salzburg had ever seen. He didn't just write checks, he showed up. He became the protector of the Red Cross. He funded the fire brigades. He built schools in the local village of Siezenheim. He restored churches. When he rode his carriage into Salzburg, people didn't sneer at him. They took off their hats and cheered. "Grüß Gott, Imperial Highness," they would shout. And Ludwig, starving for affection, would smile and wave, playing the role of the benevolent lord to perfection. It was a surreal transformation. The man who had been spat out by the moral guardians of Vienna became a local saint in Salzburg. He found a strange kind of freedom in exile. The strict protocols of the Viennese court didn't apply here. He could breathe. He invited the local elites to his palace, the mayor, the doctors, the lawyers. He created a new court, a court of the band, where the atmosphere was relaxed. The wine flowed freely, and the conversation was lively. Yet the shadow of Vienna always loomed. He knew he was being watched. The local police chief sent weekly reports to Vienna, detailing who visited Klesheim and what the Archduke was doing. Ludwig knew his letters were opened. He knew his servants were questioned. He lived in a gilded cage, but he worked tirelessly to make the cage as comfortable and beautiful as possible. This period of his life from 1904 to 1914 was his Indian summer. It was a time of quiet redemption. He was no longer the predatory Luziwuzi of the dark bathhouses. He was the eccentric old uncle of the province. He seemed to find a measure of peace. He spent hours in his garden, tending to his prize-winning roses. He organized charity balls where he would personally inspect the decorations, ensuring every flower was perfectly placed. He was channeling his obsession with control and beauty into things that benefited others, rather than just his own pleasure. But the world outside his garden walls was darkening. The tensions that would tear Europe apart were bubbling over. In 1914, the Archduke Franz Ferdinand, his nemesis, the man who had engineered his exile, traveled to Sarajevo. We all know what happened next. The shots fired by Gavrilo Princip didn't just kill the air, they killed the 19th century. When the news of the assassination reached Klesheim, Ludwig Viktor's reaction is not recorded, but one can imagine the complex storm of emotions. The man who had hated him, the man who had called him a pervert and banished him, was dead. There was surely a grim satisfaction, a sense of divine retribution, but there was also fear. War was coming, and war has no time for eccentric old princes and their porcelain collections. As the Austrian army marched to Serbia and Russia, the social embargo on Ludwig Viktor suddenly seemed petty, but it remained. While other archdukes were given commands or honorary positions to boost morale, Ludwig was ignored. He was an embarrassment that the dying empire didn't want to be reminded of. He watched the trains filled with young soldiers leaving the Salzburg station, heading to the slaughterhouse of the Eastern Front. These were the same young men in uniform he had admired all his life, the objects of his desire and his aesthetic obsession. Now, they were being fed into the meat grinder of modern warfare. The war shattered Ludwig's fragile peace. His mental health, always precarious, began to fray. The isolation, which he had managed to fill with charity and art, became absolute. The ball stopped. The money stopped flowing as the economy collapsed. The Saint of Salzburg began to retreat into the madman of Klesheim. In 1915, the final blow came. It was a silent coup, orchestrated by the remnants of the family who wanted to ensure that the Luziwuzi problem was buried forever while they fought a losing war. A commission of doctors was sent to Klesheim. They did not come to treat him, they came to sentence him. The diagnosis was vague, weakness of mind, but the effect was legal and binding. Ludwig Viktor was placed under a guardianship. He was stripped of his right to manage his own money. He was confined to a suite of 3 rooms in his own palace. Was he truly insane? There are theories that he was suffering from the late stages of syphilis, the great imitator that plagued so many men of his generation who frequented the sexual underground. Others suggest it was dementia or hardening of the arteries. But there is a strong argument that it was political incarceration. An eccentric, loose-lipped, scandal-prone archduke was a liability in wartime. It was safer to lock him up and throw away the key. For the last 4 years of his life, Ludwig Viktor existed in a twilight state. The beautiful palace he had built became a prison ward. Nuns were brought in to watch him. The man who had once held the most scandalous salons in Vienna now had no one to talk to but his nurse. He would sit by the window, looking out at the overgrown gardens, watching the seasons change, while the empire his family had built over 600 years crumbled into dust. He outlived them all, in a way. He outlived Franz Ferdinand. He outlived the old emperor Franz Joseph, who died in 1916, leaving the throne to the young and overwhelmed Karl. He outlived the empire itself. In November 1918, the war ended. The Kaiser abdicated. The Republic was proclaimed. The Habsburgs were ordered to leave Austria or renounce their titles and live as private citizens. Most fled to Switzerland or Madeira, but nobody came for Ludwig Viktor. The revolutionaries in Vienna didn't care about the crazy old man in Salzburg. The new Republican government saw no threat in Luziwuzi. He was forgotten by history before he even stopped breathing. He remained in his rooms at Klesheim, a living fossil of a vanished world, surrounded by the silent accusatory stares of his porcelain figurines. The winter of 1918 was one of the darkest in human history. The Great War had finally ground to a halt, leaving behind a continent of ghosts, shattered cities, and a generation of young men buried in the mud of Flanders and Galicia. To make matters worse, the Spanish flu was sweeping across the globe, claiming millions more lives in a terrifying pandemic. In the heart of this apocalypse, the once mighty Austro-Hungarian Empire had ceased to exist. The double-headed eagle had fallen. The Emperor Karl I had renounced his participation in the government, and the new Republic of German Austria had been proclaimed. The Habsburgs, the family that had ruled for 6 centuries, were suddenly homeless, stripped of their titles and properties, forced to pack their bags and flee into exile. But in the frozen silence of Schloss Klesheim, time seemed to stand still. Archduke Ludwig Viktor, now 76 years old, remained. He was the last ember of the old world, flickering in the cold draft of the new one. The Republican authorities, busy trying to feed a starving population and prevent a communist revolution, had little interest in evicting a senile old man who was already under medical guardianship. He was a relic, a piece of living furniture that had been left behind when the tenants moved out. The palace was freezing. Coal was scarce in post-war Austria, and the vast high-ceilinged rooms of Klesheim were impossible to heat. Ludwig Viktor spent his final days wrapped in blankets, surrounded by the silent nuns who were paid to watch him. His mind, which had once been sharp enough to cut a countess to shreds with a single witticism, was now lost in the fog of dementia. Did he know that the empire was gone? Did he know that his nemesis Franz Ferdinand was dead? Did he know that the beautiful young men he had once chased were all gone, lost to the trenches? We will never know. He existed in a suspended animation, a prisoner of his own fading memories. On January 18, 1919, the end finally came. It was not a dramatic death. There were no final words of wisdom, no state funeral preparation. He simply stopped breathing, his heart giving out under the weight of pneumonia and old age. The pink sheep of the Habsburgs was dead, but even in death, Ludwig Viktor had one final surprise for the family that had rejected him. For centuries, there was only one place for a Habsburg to rest, the imperial crypt, Kapuzinergruft, in Vienna. It is a somber, majestic vault beneath the Capuchin church, where 12 emperors and 18 empresses lie in elaborate bronze sarcophagi. It is the final roll call of the dynasty. To be buried there is to be part of history. Ludwig Viktor refused. In his last will, written before his mind had completely failed, he had left explicit instructions. He did not want to go back to Vienna. He did not want to lie next to his brother Franz Joseph, who had banished him. He did not want to lie next to Franz Ferdinand, who had hated him. He did not want to return to the city that had laughed at him, scorned him, and ultimately expelled him. He chose instead to be buried in the village cemetery of Siesenheim, a short distance from his palace in Salzburg. It was a shocking break with tradition. It was a statement of profound alienation. By choosing a village cemetery, he was identifying himself not as a prince of the blood, but as a citizen of the community that had shown him kindness. He chose to lie among the farmers, the shopkeepers, and the local families who had tipped their hats to him, not as an imperial decoration, but as a neighbor. The funeral was a quiet affair. There were no imperial guards, no gun salutes, no kings or queens in attendance. A simple procession moved through the snow-covered landscape. The grave was marked with a modest stone, not a monument. On it there were no long lists of titles, no royal and imperial highness, just a name and the dates. It was the final act of a man who had spent his life trapped in a role he couldn't play, finally shedding the costume and finding peace in anonymity. In the end, the pink sheep exposes the lie of the good old days. He reminds us that the glitter of the court concealed deep shadows of repression. His life was a performance that ended in a tragedy, but in his refusal to marry, in his refusal to be a soldier, and in his final refusal to be buried with his judges, Ludwig Viktor achieved a quiet victory. He remained to the bitter end himself. And in a world that demanded conformity or death, that was perhaps the bravest act of all.